December 14th, 1944. The air on Palawan Island tasted of gasoline and screams. This was not a rumor. This was a fact, burned into the memory of the few who escaped the inferno. 139 American prisoners of war, herded into crude trenches, doused with fuel, and set ablaze. They were shot and bayoneted if they tried to climb out from the fire. The official report, when it finally landed on a desk in Australia, was clinical, cold. The body count was a number, the method, a footnote. But the unofficial report was something else entirely. It was a story told in whispers. The story did not travel through official channels. Not at first. It was carried in the dark, passed from hand to hand on scraps of paper, spoken in hushed Tagalog from one jungle outpost to another. It came from the real witnesses, not just the handful of surviving Americans, but from the islanders who had watched in horror from the trees, the local fishermen who saw the black smoke foul the sky. They said the executions were methodical. They said it was a directive, a final, brutal order from the Japanese Imperial High Command to ensure no prisoners would be liberated, no witnesses left to testify. The whispers multiplied. They spread from Palawan to Luzon, a plague of fear. Soon the same terrifying rumor echoed around the barbed wire fences of the Cabanatuan camp, where more than 500 Allied POWs starved and prayed. It crept into the sprawling internment camp at Los Baños, holding over 2,000 men, women, and children. The rumor always ended the same way. You are next. The message reached General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters. It was a death sentence for thousands. The response was immediate, visceral, a single desperate command. Get them out. Get them all out. Now. But the command was an impossibility, an operational fantasy. The main invasion of Luzon was weeks away. Cabanatuan was 30 miles deep in enemy territory. 30 miles of Japanese patrols, checkpoints, and fortified positions. Sending a conventional force was suicide. They would be seen. They would be ambushed. They would trigger the very massacre they were trying to prevent. The intelligence officers stared at their maps, their faces grim. The charts were green, blue, and brown abstractions filled with question marks. Where were the main Japanese units? What were their patrol schedules? How many guards were on the towers at night? How thick was the wire? Nobody knew. Nobody in an American uniform knew. The might of the United States military, poised to retake an entire nation, was deaf, dumb, and blind. But they were not alone. Someone else was watching. Someone had been watching for 3 long years since the fall of Bataan and the infamous Death March. They were an army of ghosts living in the space between the villages and the jungle. A force of over 250,000 men and women who never surrendered. They were Filipino scouts, former Commonwealth soldiers, farmers, doctors, and teenagers. They had names, men like Captain Juan Pajota and Captain Eduardo Hozon. They had built a shadow government, a clandestine intelligence network that MacArthur himself had called his secret weapon. They had their own agents inside the camps. They smuggled in food and medicine, messages of hope. They knew the names of the Japanese commanders. They knew the terrain not from maps, but from a lifetime of walking it. They counted the sentries, they timed the patrols, they drew diagrams of the guard towers in the dirt with a stick. While American planners in Australia saw only obstacles, the guerrillas saw pathways. While official reports spoke of certain failure, the whispers from the jungle spoke of a chance. A slim chance. The declassified files from these operations use sterile language to describe their role. Guerrilla cooperation. Logistical support. This is the story of what that truly meant. It is a story of an alliance forged in desperation and a debt written in blood. Chapter 1. June 3rd, 1943. Camp Algona, Iowa. A U-boat captain was living in the middle of a cornfield. Nobody believed it. It made no sense. Iowa had no coastline, no ports, no strategic naval value whatsoever. It had corn, hogs, and quiet farming towns populated by the descendants of German and Scandinavian immigrants. Towns like St. Joseph, Bode, Louverne, Corwith. You could drive for 100 miles and see nothing but the straight black line of the highway dividing an endless sea of green stalks under a vast, empty sky. But the fact was there. A fact buried in classified transfer manifests and the nervous memories of a few old men. Facts are stubborn things. His name was Kapitän Zursee Wolfgang Richter, age 41, commander of the U-488. They called him Der Atlantikgeist, the Atlantic Ghost. His boat was a Type Milchkuh, a supply submarine, the lifeline for the Wolfpack's hunting in the mid-Atlantic Gap. Richter wasn't a celebrity ace who sank battleships. He was something more important. He was a logistician, a grand strategist of the deep. He knew the routes, the schedules, the refueling points, the secret vulnerabilities of the entire German submarine campaign. He was one of the most valuable naval intelligence assets the Allies could possibly capture. And they put him in Iowa. The official story was bland, a lie made of paper and ink. The folder was designated POW T-7934. It stated that Captain Richter, captured after the scuttling of his submarine 500 miles west of the Azores, was transferred to Camp Algona for routine processing and internment. He was listed alongside hundreds of other names, common names. Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufmann, Klein, Gross, men from the Afrika Korps, men from the Luftwaffe, foot soldiers, bakers, mechanics, clerks, not commanders, not ghosts. The transfer order, document 701B, noted his destination was chosen due to ample capacity and low security risk. Ample capacity, low security risk. That was the first crack in the story. Camp Algona was not a fortress like Papago Park in Arizona or Camp Forest in Tennessee, places built to hold the most fanatical, the most dangerous, the most escape-prone officers. Algona was a gentleman's camp, a farm camp. The prisoners worked on local farms for 80 cents a day, helping with the harvest. They were watched by a handful of guards from the Iowa National Guard, old men and young boys. It was a place you sent a weary Wehrmacht corporal, not the mastermind of the U-boat supply chain. Not a man with the entire Battle of the Atlantic mapped inside his head. And yet, there he was. The rumors started almost immediately. They whispered in the mess hall. They whispered in the guard towers. Quiet talk passed from man to man. The German captain didn't work in the fields. He never left the main compound. He had a private room in Barracks 4, not a bunk in the open bay. He received special meals. Some said they saw the camp commandant, Major Arthur Davies, a stern, by-the-book hardware store owner from Des Moines, personally delivering his food tray. Major Davies's logbook was a testament to military precision. Weather, prisoner count, supply levels. Everything noted, everything correct. But on June 5, 1943, a new kind of entry appeared. A single line written in a tighter, more deliberate script. Asset R secure. Phase 1 initiated. The entry for the next day was even stranger. Civilian consultant arrived 2200 hours. Meeting with R until 0345. Who was the civilian? Where did he come from? The guards on the night shift saw the car, a black Ford sedan with no markings. Government plates. It didn't come from town. It came from the east, from the direction of Chicago, or maybe further. The man who got out was tall, thin, wore a dark suit and a fedora, even in the humid Iowa night. He didn't look like a farmer. He didn't look like an Iowan. He looked like someone from Washington. He looked like a spy. The prisoners gave Richter a wide berth. They were told he was being held for interrogation. But it wasn't an interrogation. Interrogations were loud. They involved stress positions, sleep deprivation, threats. This was quiet, civil. The guards would see Richter and the man in the suit through the window of the commandant's office, sitting across from each other at a small table. There were papers spread between them, blueprints, charts, and a chessboard. They played chess for hours. Richter always played with the black pieces. Always. The project needed a name. The men on the wire gave it one. A joke at first. They called it the Cornfield Project. But it wasn't a joke. Other things began to arrive. Crates delivered in the middle of the night by army trucks. They were marked meteorological survey equipment or agricultural research samples. But the soldiers unloading them were not from the Quartermaster Corps. They were engineers, men with slide rules on their belts and a cold, dismissive look in their eyes. They spoke to no one. They reported only to Major Davies. And Davies reported to a telephone line that, according to the camp switchboard operator, bypassed all local exchanges and went straight to a number in Maryland. Fort Meade, Maryland, home of the Signal Intelligence Service. The pieces didn't fit. A U-boat commander, a spy in a fedora, Army engineers, a direct line to the codebreakers, and all of it happening in a sleepy POW camp surrounded by 1,000,000 acres of corn. It was a puzzle with too many pieces. Or not enough. Then came the other names. The other prisoners. They weren't brought in with the general population. They arrived one by one, also in unmarked cars, also in the dead of night. Unteroffizier Klaus Zimmermann, a radio specialist captured in Normandy. Dr. Arndt Hauser, a physicist from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute who had been working on heavy water experiments in Norway. Hauptmann Erich Schmidt, a Luftwaffe pilot who had tested experimental jet aircraft at Rechlin. A naval strategist, a radio expert, a physicist, an aeronautical engineer. They were a team, a German team, assembled in the heart of America. In late August, Private First Class Jimmy O'Connell, a 19-year-old from Keokuk, was on late-night patrol. He was bored, he was lonely. He walked the perimeter, the sound of crickets and the rustle of dry cornstalks his only company. He paused by Barracks 4. The light was on in Richter's room. It was always on. But the blackout curtain had a small tear in the corner. A tiny sliver of light. O'Connell was curious. He crept closer, his boots silent in the soft dust. He put his eye to the tear. Richter was not alone. Major Davies was there. The man in the fedora was there. And Klaus Zimmermann, the radio man, was there too. They were huddled over a massive map spread across a table. It was not a map of the Atlantic Ocean. It was not a map of Europe. It was a map of the continental United States. It was covered in strange symbols, circles and lines drawn in red grease pencil. A web of connections spanning the entire country, from Washington State to Florida, from Maine to California. Richter was holding a long wooden pointer. He wasn't asking questions. He wasn't being interrogated. He was giving a lecture. He tapped the map. Once, twice. His finger rested on a point in the empty, desolate landscape of the high desert, a place of rock and sagebrush hundreds of miles from anything, a place called Los Alamos, New Mexico. Major Davies looked at the man in the fedora. The man nodded, a grim, tight motion. Richter looked up, his pale blue eyes seeming to stare directly at the tear in the curtain, directly at Private O'Connell. A cold smile touched his lips. And then the main thing started. Chapter 2, May 16th, 1944, Hancock County, Iowa. 400,000 German prisoners of war were living on American soil. A city the size of Minneapolis, a metropolis of the enemy scattered across the heartland. 400,000. That's more than the entire population of Des Moines. 400,000 men in Feldgrau uniforms, eating American food, breathing American air, sleeping under American stars. The War Department had a plan. A simple plan. The Emergency Farm Labor Program. The official documents were clear. Prisoners would provide manpower. They would detassel corn, harvest soybeans, lift sugar beets, bale flax. It sounded sensible. It sounded efficient. It was a lie. Or at least it was not the whole truth. And the truth, what little of it existed, was buried deep in the black Iowa soil. Major Frank H. Stevens saw it first. 42 years old. A civil engineer from Ames before the war, a man who understood stress points and load-bearing walls. He understood when a structure was not what it seemed. His official title was Liaison Officer for Camp Algona and its 34 branch camps. A bureaucratic title. It meant he was a glorified babysitter. It meant he was supposed to count shovels and make sure the locals weren't selling schnapps to the prisoners. But Stevens read manifests. He read them every night, under the yellow light of a single desk lamp, the hum of mosquitoes a constant companion. The manifests were wrong. They felt wrong. Something was wrong with the men. The lists were not just full of farmers and shopkeepers conscripted into the Wehrmacht. Not just scared boys from the Hitler Youth. Not just weary infantrymen captured in North Africa. There were others. The files were thin, almost deliberately empty, but the designations were there, typed in stark black ink. Kriegsmarine ordnance technicians. Luftwaffe avionics engineers. Signals intelligence specialists from the Funkhorchdienst. Men who knew how to build, how to code, how to listen. Then he saw the names: Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufmann, Kleine, Gross. And next to their names, a previous posting. Peenemünde Army Research Center. Men from Peenemünde. The place where the vengeance weapons were born. The nest of the V1 and the V2. The kingdom of Werner von Braun. These were not men you sent to pick corn. These were men you locked in a concrete box and interrogated for 1,000 years. Yet here they were, in Iowa. Officially, they were assigned to agricultural surveying. Unofficially, nobody knew. The rumors spread like dandelion seeds on the prairie wind, whispers in the diners of Garner and the feed stores of Britt. Lights seen burning in Barrack C at 3 in the morning. Military trucks, their canvas sides pulled tight and sealed, arriving not at the main gate but at a little-used service road at the camp's northern edge. Trucks that came from the east, maybe from the Rock Island Arsenal, maybe from Chicago, maybe from farther. That's how it began. Major Stevens started a folder, a private one. He kept it locked in the bottom drawer of his metal desk. He labeled it simply anomalies. He noted the truck schedules. He noted the power consumption spikes from Barrack C, metered separately for some forgotten administrative reason. He sat in his Ford sedan on a county road a mile away, watching the camp through binoculars. He saw the regular prisoners march out to the fields at dawn, their shoulders slumped. But the men from Barrack C never went to the fields. They walked in the enclosed yard, always talking, always gesturing. They looked less like prisoners and more like academics at a very strange, very tense university symposium. And then the main thing started. There was one man they all deferred to. He was not the highest-ranking officer. Not officially. His name was Dr. Eric Kessler, age 51, a civilian. His file stated he was an artillery ballistics consultant captured near Cherbourg. It was a clumsy fiction. Stevens had worked with physicists at Iowa State before the war. He knew the type, the quiet intensity. The eyes that looked at the world and saw only equations and forces. Kessler was a physicist, a brilliant one. You could tell by the way the others watched him, the way they fell silent when he spoke. One sweltering afternoon in July, Stevens watched from his perch on the hill. Kessler was at a makeshift table in the yard. He was drawing, not on a blackboard, on a massive sheet of paper held down with rocks. He was drawing something. It was not a gun. It was not a fortification. It was something else. Stevens focused his binoculars. The sweat dripped into his eyes. He wiped it away. The drawing was a series of intricate concentric circles. There were annotations in a tiny, precise script. There were lines branching off, leading to smaller diagrams of what looked like wiring harnesses and magnetic coils. It looked like a machine. A very, very strange machine. Kessler was pointing to a spot in the center of the drawing, explaining something to two of the other Peenemünde men, Schneider and Gross. Stevens felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. It was the same feeling he got when he looked at a bridge and saw a hairline fracture in a critical support beam. This whole camp was a lie. A structural, catastrophic lie. That night, a storm rolled in, a real Iowa gully washer. The power across the county flickered and died. The camp was plunged into darkness, punctuated by the sweeping beams of the watchtower spotlights. The official report would blame a lightning strike on a substation in Corwith. Stevens didn't believe it. He used the chaos. He slipped out of his office, the anomalies folder tucked inside his raincoat. He made his way to the fence surrounding Barrack C. The guards were distracted, shouting into their radios. He found the spot he had noted earlier, a section of the fence where the wire was looser. He was not a young man, but he pulled himself through. The air inside the compound was different. It smelled of ozone. The sharp, electric smell of powerful machinery recently turned off. He moved to the side of the barracks to a window that was slightly ajar. He peered inside. Empty bunks, footlockers, and in the center of the room, the large table. The schematic was gone, but something else was there. A small object left behind in the hasty cleanup. It glinted in the intermittent sweep of the searchlight. Stevens pried the window open a few more inches, reached in, and his fingers closed around cold, smooth metal. He pulled it out. It was a cylinder no bigger than his thumb, machined from what looked like tungsten. It was surprisingly heavy, and it was warm. Not hot, just warm, as if it held a deep, internal energy. He stood there in the rain, the strange metal object in his palm, 1,000 questions screaming in his mind. The biggest one was simple. What were they building in the middle of a cornfield? He found the answer an hour later, or the beginning of one. He broke the lock on Kessler's personal footlocker. It was mostly books. Goethe, Schiller, a volume of quantum mechanics. But under a false bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with dense equations. Stevens flipped through them, his heart pounding against his ribs. He couldn't understand the math, but he understood the diagrams. They were more detailed versions of the schematic he'd seen. And on the very last page, a single hand-drawn map. It was not a map of Iowa, it was not Europe. It was a desolate stretch of desert, marked with a single X. Beneath it, 2 words were written in Kessler's neat script. Jornada del Muerto, New Mexico. Chapter 3, August 19th, 1944. Papago Park, Arizona. A German naval officer was methodically destroying his life's work. In his head. His name was Oberleutnant zur See Hans Dietrich von Lössl. Kriegsmarine. 28 years old. He was not a submariner, not one of the gray wolves who haunted the Atlantic. He was a navigator, a master of celestial mathematics, captured when his auxiliary cruiser, the Cormoran, met its end in the Indian Ocean. Now he sat under the brutal Arizona sun, 1,000 miles from any ocean, and erased the star charts from his mind. One constellation at a time, one coastal detail at a time. The information was useless here. Worse than useless. It was a liability. Knowledge was a weapon. And in a prison camp, every weapon is a danger to its owner. Nobody knew what he was doing. The American Guard saw a quiet, scholarly man, a man who borrowed books on geology and desert flora from the camp library. A strange hobby. The other prisoners, the soldiers from the Africa Corps, saw a stiff-necked naval officer. Too proud, too quiet. They whispered he was Dirchfall, a washout. They were wrong. He wasn't washing out. He was clearing the decks. Preparing for something new. He just didn't know what it was yet. And then the list arrived. It came on a Tuesday, delivered by a stern-faced major from the Provost Marshal General's office who flew in from Washington. The folder was thin. Manila cardstock, stamped urgent and confidential in stark red ink. The camp commandant, Colonel Ames, opened it with a letter opener that was a miniature Japanese katana. A souvenir from a friend in the Pacific. Ames read the list. His face, normally ruddy from the desert sun and evening whiskey, went pale. Just 6 names. Von Lössl, Hans Dietrich. Oberleutnant zur See. Schneider, Franz. Hauptmann, Pioniere. An army engineer who built fortifications on the Atlantic Wall. Becker, Wilhelm. Leutnant, Luftwaffe. an avionics specialist captured in Sicily. His specialty was radio guidance systems. Wagner Klaus, a civilian, a chemist from the IG Farben plant at Ludwigshafen, picked up in occupied France under suspicious circumstances. Age 52. Kaufmann Ernst, a Sonderführer in the Abwehr, a quiet man who spoke 5 languages. Gross Peter. Oberfeldwebel, a tank mechanic from the 21st Panzer Division. A genius with engines. A man who could make a tractor engine perform like a Messerschmitt. 6 names. A navigator, an engineer, a radio man, a chemist, a spy, a mechanic. It was not a group, it was a team. But for what? The orders were simple. Prepare listed detainees for immediate transfer. Destination: Branch Camp, Algona, Iowa. Iowa, the corn state. Colonel Ames read the order again. Iowa, it made no sense. You don't send a team of high-value specialists to pick corn. You don't send an IG Farben chemist to detassel corn. You don't send a master spy to bale hay. Ames had been in the army for 30 years. He had seen strange orders, inexplicable orders. But this was different. This felt wrong. The order had a code word at the bottom, a single word. Harvest. It sounded so simple, so rural, so American. Harvest. The rumor started that afternoon. A guard, a private first class named O'Malley from Brooklyn, swore he heard the major from Washington talking on a secure line. The talent is secured, the major had said. Harvest is ready for planting. O'Malley told his sergeant. The sergeant told a lieutenant. By nightfall, the entire American contingent was buzzing. They were sending the Krauts somewhere secret. Maybe to help with the bomb, the atomic bomb. That's what they were whispering about out in the desert of New Mexico. Los Alamos, a place that didn't officially exist, but the transfer order said Iowa. Iowa, Iowa, Iowa. The word felt like a lie. The camp's intelligence officer, Captain Davies, thought it was a lie too. He was a former history professor from Princeton. He saw patterns. He saw connections. He pulled the files on the 6 men. Born in Hamburg, Stuttgart, Essen, Munich, Dresden, Cologne. All captured between 1942 and 1944. All of them captured under unusual circumstances. Schneider's bunker complex had surrendered without a fight. Becker's plane had landed almost perfectly intact. Wagner was found with a forged passport and a briefcase full of chemical formulas. Every one of them was taken with their knowledge intact. Their brains were the prize? Intact. That's how it began. Davies typed up a report. For his own files, a just-in-case report. The folder was labeled Project Harvest. He noted the collection of skills. He noted the illogical destination. The assembly of this specialized brain trust, he wrote, comprising expertise in navigation, advanced engineering, chemical processes, and intelligence, is inconsistent with their stated reassignment to an agricultural labor detachment in Iowa. It suggests a clandestine operation of the highest priority, masked by a low-security transfer. He took out his pen and added a handwritten note at the bottom. What are we harvesting in Iowa? And then the main thing started. The transfer was scheduled for 2,200 hours. Not a normal procedure. Transfers happened in daylight. Everything happened in daylight in the desert. But this was different. At dusk, 2 heavy trucks rolled into camp. Not army olive drab. They were painted flat black. No markings, no unit insignia. The men who drove them were not soldiers. They wore khaki trousers and shirts without rank. They carried pistols and shoulder holsters. They had hard, flat eyes. They didn't speak to the camp guards. They spoke only to the major from Washington. The 6 Germans were assembled in the commandant's office. They stood in a line. Von Lossel watched them. He saw the same question in their eyes. The engineer, Schneider, was trying to appear calm, but his hands were clenched into fists. The chemist, Wagner, looked terrified. He was a civilian, a man of laboratories, not barracks. Only Kaufman, the spy, seemed relaxed. He looked almost amused. The major addressed them, in perfect, unaccented German. Gentlemen, you have been selected for a special duty. Your cooperation will be noted and will have a significant bearing on your future. He did not say more. He did not need to. They were marched out to the black trucks. The night was cold. The desert stars were brilliant. Von Losel looked up, instinctively searching for Polaris. A habit. A lifetime of habit. He could find his position within 100 yards just from the stars. He wondered where he was going. He wondered if he would ever see the stars from the deck of a ship again. They were not heading for the local train station at Tempe. The trucks bypassed it, turning onto a dark, unmarked service road that led into the desert. An hour later, they stopped. On the tracks, a train was waiting. It was not a passenger train, not a freight train. It was just 3 carriages and an engine. The middle carriage had blacked-out windows. Steel plates were bolted over them from the outside. One of the hard-eyed men unlocked the door. Inside. The 6 Germans climbed in. The door slammed shut. A heavy bolt slid home. It was pitch black. They were alone. The train lurched, then began to move. Slowly at first, then gaining speed. Heading east, towards Iowa or somewhere else. Hours passed in the darkness. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the click-clack of the wheels on the rails and the breathing of 6 men. Von Losel, the navigator, closed his eyes. He wasn't erasing his memory now. He was building a new map. He felt the gentle curve of the track to the south, a long, sustained turn. He counted the seconds. He estimated the speed. They were not on the main line to El Paso. This was a spur. Heading southeast, towards New Mexico, towards the secret places on the map. Suddenly, the brakes hissed. The train slowed. It stopped. The silence was absolute. They were in the middle of nowhere. Then they heard it. The sound of engines. Trucks, approaching fast. The heavy bolt on their carriage door was drawn back with a loud metallic clang. The door swung open. A single bare bulb hanging from a pole cast a harsh yellow light inside. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was not one of the hard-eyed men. He was older, dressed in a civilian suit that looked expensive, even in the gloom. He spoke. His voice was calm, cultured, with an accent they could not quite place. Not American, not British, something else. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said, still speaking in German. "Forget Iowa." He stepped aside, and the man standing behind him came into the light. He was a German, an SS Oberfuhrer. They all recognized him instantly from photographs, from intelligence briefings, from the wanted lists. He was a key figure in the Reich's most secret weapons programs. A man who had vanished from Berlin in 1943. A man the Allies had officially declared dead. A man named Hans Kammler. Chapter 4. December 2nd, 1944. Fort Hunt, Virginia. The walls were wired, not for electricity, for secrets. Microphones small as a shirt button were hidden inside the light fixtures, tucked behind loose bricks in the chimneys, sunk into the wooden legs of the mess hall tables. They were even buried in the trunks of the oak trees lining the exercise yard. Nothing was private. Nothing. This was Post Office Box 1142, the most secret prison on American soil, and its only purpose was to listen. Every breath, every whisper, every curse was currency. Lieutenant Arthur Jacobson, 24 years old, adjusted his headphones. The static hissed like a serpent. Jacobson, a linguistics prodigy from Brooklyn, had learned German so thoroughly he sometimes dreamed in it. His job was not to interrogate. His job was to overhear. To sit in a cramped, windowless room filled with humming amplifiers and whirring tape machines, and sift through the endless, meaningless chatter of the Reich's captured elite. He was a gold panner in a river of noise. A river of German noise. Miles of magnetic tape spooled onto black metal reels. Every 24 hours, a new mountain of it. The voices of U-boat commanders, Luftwaffe aces, Panzer generals, and Wehrmacht scientists all tangled together. They spoke of the food, the boredom, the American guards. They argued about soccer. They hummed songs from home. They complained. God, how they complained. About the weak coffee, the humid Virginia air, the indignity of it all. It was mostly guffazzle, garbage, useless chatter, but sometimes a fleck of gold. The intelligence officers wanted everything: U-boat patrol routes, V-weapon launch sites, jet engine schematics, radar frequencies, atomic research progress. They wanted names, weaknesses, political leanings. A list of targets whispered in the dark could change the course of a bombing raid. A single technical term uttered in frustration could give Allied engineers the breakthrough they needed. The names they hunted were legendary, almost mythical. Hartigan, Top, Merton, Luth, Kretschmer. But one name appeared more than any other, on every briefing sheet, in every morning meeting. Oberleutnant Cersei Hans-Dietrich von Tiesenhausen, the hero of Scapa Flow, the commander who sank the HMS Barham. He was not here. He was 3,000 miles away, under the relentless Arizona sun in Papago Park. But his ghost haunted Fort Hunt. His file, thick as a Bible, sat on the desk of the station chief, Colonel Daniel B. Brooks. The reports from Arizona were a litany of failure. Subject is uncooperative. Subject reads philosophy. Subject refuses all but the most necessary conversation. Subject stares at the wall for hours. Von Tiesenhausen was a black hole. Information went in. Nothing came out. Not to the interrogators, not to the guards, not even to the other high-value prisoners who shared his barracks. His silence was a weapon, a perfectly calibrated instrument of defiance. Silence from Arizona. Day after day, week after week. It was maddening. The man was a walking encyclopedia of the U-boat war. He knew the technology, the tactics, the commanders, the codes. He knew everything, and he said nothing. They called him the monk, the sphinx, the silent knight. The Americans grew desperate. They bugged his bunk, his books, even the heel of his shoe. They got nothing. The silence was absolute. The silence was a fortress, and then a whisper. The whisper came from Iowa, from a low-level prisoner at Camp Algona, a place for the rank and file, not the Knights of the Reich. A 19-year-old U-boat mechanic, Erich Lange, captured from a sunken milk cow submarine in the mid-Atlantic. He had a fever. In the camp infirmary, delirious, he started talking in his sleep. A microphone hidden in the bed frame, intended to catch talk of escape plans, caught it all. The transcript landed on Jacobson's desk because it mentioned a U-boat. Standard procedure. Jacobson scanned the pages. Fever dream nonsense. Jumbled memories of a sinking boat, the cold water, his mother's cooking, a girl from Kiel. Lange, Schmidt, Bauer, Mueller, Hoffman, Richter. Names of his dead crewmates. Then a few clear phrases broke through the static of the boy's dying mind. Der Kapitän weiß es. The captain knows. Immer ruhig, auch im Feuer. Always calm, even in the fire. Standard hero worship. Jacobson was about to file it away, but the next line made him stop. The blood drained from his face. Der Kapitän. Seine Karte im Kopf. The captain, his map in his head. Jacobson's hand trembled as he put the transcript down. His map in his head. It was the exact phrase from a top-secret ONI memo that had circulated a month prior. A memo based on a single, uncorroborated rumor from a source in neutral Sweden. They had thought it was a metaphor, a figure of speech, but this was different. This was a kid, delirious with no reason to lie, echoing the most secret whisper in Allied intelligence. It was real. Von Tiesenhausen wasn't just being silent. He was protecting something. He was actively, methodically destroying a map inside his own mind. A map of what? Jacobson read the last line of the transcript. The mechanic, Erich Lange, had thrashed in his bed. He had shouted one more word, a single guttural word, spoken not in fear but in what sounded like awe, or maybe terror. a word that made no sense. Gnome. Jacobson looked it up in the dictionary. A gnome, a mythical creature, a dwarf from a fairy tale. It was nothing, a piece of a fever, a dead end. He almost laughed. He almost threw the file in the burn bag, but he didn't, because he had seen the word before. Just once. It was in the margins of a heavily redacted intelligence summary about advanced German acoustic torpedo guidance systems. A file so secret it was kept in Colonel Brooks's personal safe. Next to the word, someone, maybe Brooks himself, had drawn a small circle in red ink. Naim? Jacobson stared at the transcript, then at the wall, as if he could see through it, all the way to Arizona. The map was not the secret. The map was the path to the secret. And the secret had a name. How does history account for a debt that was never recorded on paper? The archives hold the grand tallies, the tonnage of ships sunk, the number of battalions engaged, the names of generals and the dates of their victories etched in cold official stone. But there is another ledger, a ledger of flesh and spirit. It does not speak of divisions. It speaks of a whispered warning on a moonless night that diverted a death march. It speaks of a child standing lookout on a dusty road. It speaks of a shared handful of rice that meant a week of hunger for a family who had nothing left to give but their own survival. It speaks of the fisherman who guided a raft of skeletal men past a Japanese patrol, only to be executed for his compassion the following day. These were not statistics. They were acts of impossible grace, played out in the shadows of a history written by others. This was not a war of nations fought on a map. It was a war of humanity fought in the heart. A war of simple, impossible choices made in the steaming jungle in the quiet village. They came not as warriors in uniform, dispatched by a government. They came as farmers with bolos, as teachers with secrets, as priests with hidden radios. They were the conquered who refused to be victims. They became the saviors. Their payment was not in victory parades, not in commendations or pensions. Their payment was in the quiet knowledge of a life preserved, a life that was not their own. It was a debt of blood, a debt of honor, a debt of silence. The truth, then, remains somewhere between the lines, between the archival files in Washington, between the forgotten graves scattered across Luzon. It is a story told not in words but in echoes. The echo of a promise kept between a starving prisoner and a barefoot guerrilla. The echo of a life given for a stranger from a land half a world away. The final accounting is not found in any book, and perhaps it never will be. It exists in the heavy silence that follows the question of what we truly owe to those who dragged us from the dark. Some debts are not meant to be repaid. They are meant to be carried,